Joining us this afternoon is Marc Spooner. Marc is a professor in the Faculty of Education at the University of Regina. He's chair and organizer of tonight's public panel and the larger symposium, What Are Universities For? And with him in our Regina studio today is Joel Westheimer. He's a university research chair in democracy and education at the University of Ottawa. He'll be part of tonight's panel, but first he has joined us today for Blue Sky. And with that, Joel, thanks so much for joining us today.
Oh, it's great to be here, Garth. Thank you.
And Marc, thanks so much for coming in.
Thanks a lot.
Marc, why did you want to organize this symposium in the first place? Why is the role of universities an important topic, even a topic right now?
Well, I think it's increasingly become an issue where we have to decide what kind of society we want and how universities can be best positioned to serve the kind of society that we want to create, that aspirational ideal of a democratic society where people can follow their heart and their passions and work at where they're qualified and where they find it motivating and meaningful. So what we've been finding across Canada and really globally, there's an increasing pressure on universities to serve industry and the labor market to the exclusivity of these other important factors that and facets that the university serves, including groundbreaking research, exploring the human condition, what it means to be human, what's our relationship to the environment and to all the other flora and fauna that surround us, all the way to, at a university, there's at any one time, there's on one part of the campus, someone's learning how to be a teacher, someone's learning how to be a health professional, and someone's doing groundbreaking research. And at another place, someone's learning how to better market a product and bring that product to the market. So the university itself is really a multiversity. There's all kinds of things happening. It's not just one place as we tend to think of it as uni, as one, but really it's a multifaceted enterprise.
What makes them unique and relevant in society today?
Well, universities themselves have been one of the longest-serving institutions in society that go back continuously for thousands of years. People maybe don't realize that, but for thousands of years, universities have been serving humanity, and I think that's important to keep in mind. Universities serve society in many ways, one by upholding our democratic traditions and teaching people how to hone their skills in terms of participating and being a citizen in a democracy. I think that's very important. As we see globally, there's a democratic backsliding. We see democratic drift where authoritarianism is creeping in. But also when you get a vaccine or when you get treated at a medical center, those are medical breakthroughs that by and large were discovered and researched at a university. So universities serve society in any number of ways.
Joel, how have we seen universities shift over the years in the kind of programs they offer and the emphasis on those programs?
Yeah, it's a great question because one of the historic ideals of universities in Canadian and American society has been the enabling of a democratic society to function, because that's not an automatic thing. As we just heard Marc say, we're seeing an incredible decline of commitments to democratic society and to democratic institutions, not just around the world, but in Canada as well. And we tended to think that this was, every generation just was born into a commitment to democracy, but that's not the case. The great philosopher John Dewey said that democracy must be born anew with every generation, and education is its midwife. And of course, universities have an important role to play and used to have that role as the center of their mission, the idea that democratic citizens needed to be educated to be able to participate in a democracy. What's happened now over the last 20 years or so is a kind of assault on that mission of universities and a transformation of that mission to one exclusively of job training. Look, nobody thinks that people shouldn't graduate from university with the ability to get a good job. That's clearly part of the mission, is to develop the skills and the knowledge necessary for people to find meaningful employment. But in a democratic society, that's not enough. We need a lot more than that.
How does a 4-year degree in philosophy or political studies get you a job?
Well, this is what's funny. There's all this wrangling now about, the STEM areas will give people jobs and English and philosophy won't. But a few years ago, there were all these studies that showed that the skills that many employers want are actually the ones you gain in liberal arts and the kind of things that are pushed to the margins now. And in fact, English majors immediately upon graduation earned less than STEM majors. But 10 years down the road, they were on the whole earning more. Now, I don't like this as a metric for the success of the university, but what I'm saying is that even on that playing field, English departments win.
Okay, I want to bring in our first caller. Billy in Strasbourg has been waiting patiently. Hi, Billy.
Hi. Yeah, I great topic today. I really was excited to hear about it, and I agree with most of what your guest said, especially your first guest, Marc Spooner there. I think that industry being served above all else is unfortunately the overwhelming theme at universities right now. And personally, I kind of took myself a step back, just honestly because I can't afford to go to university right now. I still kind of see it as a place of learning for the privileged. For example, I still work as an educator without the full professional accreditation of being a teacher. And it's more, again, a funding thing. The other thing I just wanted to point out I didn't like to see at the university is it's not so much a place of free speech anymore. Mm-hmm. And I think it's a lot of how it's structured. So, for example, I remember, about a decade ago when I was on campus and the support workers went on strike, the university governance had closed-door meetings with KPMG, advisors, and, chose to bring in like a corporate strike-breaking team instead of, negotiating. And that just kind of shows how they're acting more and more like corporations. And I've even seen, too, other professors who, dare to speak on, let's say, the sensitive Israel-Palestine issue and express an opinion on that, and to be, censored or have to fight for their jobs or have events canceled for that. So I'm a little cynical right now of the reality of the universities. I feel like another main focus of the U of R is using international students for cash flow and focusing on bringing in more of those because they make more money on them and seeing students as resources rather than, a learning future. So I think it's a great topic, and that's kind of where I come from, in my opinion.
Right.
Thank you.
Billy, thanks for the call. Lots to follow up there, lots to unpack. And I'll start with you, Joel, because it sort of follows along the conversation we were having, and that is the corporatization of universities. Now, I don't know a lot about the University of Ottawa, but I can tell you the University of Saskatchewan has a lot of corporate-sponsored chairs, and the old adage, he who pays the piper calls the tune. Do you share Billy's concerns?
I do. I share those concerns a lot. One of the major trends we've seen is the increasing sort of corporate takeover of the university. And that we see in two ways. One is the idea that universities and not corporations themselves should be responsible for training people for corporate work. That used to be the purview of the corporation. They would pay people while they were being trained for that work. Corporations have successfully managed to download that work onto universities. This is at the same time that funding for universities has plummeted and tuition has risen. So what Billy said about not being able to afford to be at universities and universities being for a certain group, a privileged, that historically, of course, universities were for the privileged, but one of the most amazing trends that we saw was the opening up of universities to a much broader view of the society. Now we have students having to work full-time, having to do university at the same time. And of course, then you end up with a situation where people ask, what are universities going to do for me? As opposed to, what does my attending university do for society?
I'm going to go back to the phone lines in a moment. But Marc, I want to get your thoughts on another of Billy's points, and that was I'm putting words in Billy's mouth now, but the use of international students as cash cows.
Yeah, I think this speaks to the underfunding of universities as a whole. And what Billy said is a point I take to heart, that if students are graduating with, say, a mortgage on their house of knowledge, it kind of represents an intergenerational theft of opportunity that those in power now who they themselves benefited from affordable higher education are now turning around and underfunding it and pushing that on to students. And so the great gains we've made in inclusivity, where more people could come to university and it became more accessible to more people, those are being eroded again because people have the fear of going in debt, and it's a rightful meaning. It makes sense to have a fear of graduating with a big debt because they're shouldering more of the burden of the tuition cost. And I think that we as a society and those of us who are maybe starting to get a bit older need to think about what kind of opportunities are we leaving for the next generation. And that goes across the board, where the university serves very well in any number of ways if people can afford to go. And that's the main part. If we really want to truly create opportunities for the next generation, we have to fund them and we have to treat them like we were treated. And I think that's an important piece.
Yeah, well, have universities become dependent now on international students and their fees?
Well, absolutely. I think they have. As the provincial envelope shrinks, that money's made up in other places. And the places that money's made up in is international students and seeking corporate funding, corporate partnerships, industry funding, that kind of thing. But as you said before, you said it quite well, he who pays the piper calls the tune. And so we have all kinds of research gets directed to serve the market only and not to serve the greater good of society.
Okay, let's hear from caller John near Francis. Hi, John.
Hi.
You go ahead, John.
Yeah, I went to university for an extended period of time throughout the 80s and early 90s when it was really affordable. And I did a large variety of subjects, from psychology to mathematics to chemistry to history. I took a wide variety of things that were of interest to me, and I found that to be very valuable when I actually entered the workforce. And my wife, she also graduated, and she just graduated with her education degree. And with that, all it gave her was just the core subjects that she needed to do her education. She didn't do any electives or anything to, help with her interests.
Well, John, what was the value to you of that extended post-secondary education?
Value for me was it helped me develop a critical thinking skills and thinking outside the box. My wife told me many times I'm more a concept person than a peg and hole sort of person. She's more the hole. So she found it very beneficial for her education degree, but and for what she's teaching. But large constructs she finds difficult at times. Whereas for me, it's very easy to deal with.
John, before you go, if you were trying to launch off on that academic career today, if you had to pay today's tuition rates, for instance, would that change your attitude?
A little bit, but I would still try to do what I did because for me, I find myself having a very well-rounded education. I took subjects in many different areas. At one point in my university career, I did a very specific focus thing for a short period of time for addiction counseling, which I retired from 2 years ago after 27 years. So I would still encourage my daughter, who's about to go into university, to try to do what I did.
All right. John, thanks for the call.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
Now, gentlemen, John is obviously of a vintage, shall we say. Is that sort of university career even possible anymore unless you come from really big bucks? Mark?
Well, I think it becomes increasingly less possible because that time of discovery is eaten up because you get a situation where you have premature foreclosure on the discovery period because you're so worried about the debt you're incurring that you focus on the job rather than discovering how you can be in society and how best to serve our communities. And I think that that's an important point, that in the past people could afford to dip around, put your toe in liberal arts, put your toe in philosophy, check it out and see maybe business is for you, maybe it isn't. And there wasn't this increased pressure to perform and to get a job right away. And it was more about self-discovery, but also in doing so, you could discover how you would best give those skills to the community and make the community a better place.
Now, Joel, what are your thoughts on, the cold hard fact is, and again, unless you come from, generational wealth, what do you think the effect on democracy is of a whole generation of people missing out on that opportunity to learn simply for the sake of learning?
Yeah, we've lost the language to talk about universities as anything other than job training. And that's part of the problem because young people growing up today are immersed in that language and don't even hear the language that the two callers were talking about, universities for broader goals and exploration and critical thinking and creativity and to lead happy and engaged and meaningful lives. So when we think about the role of universities in furthering democracy, I mean, one of the things I like to think about is should universities be any different in a democratic society than in a totalitarian one? When you think about the subjects taught for job training, there's going to be a lot of courses that are the same in one or the other, math and a foreign language or, all kinds of things. But what about the role that universities have to play in furthering democracy? Well, in democracies, we need to teach people to ask difficult questions, to be able to deal with multiple perspectives, to think about the way we govern ourselves and how we could govern ourselves. In a totalitarian society, you don't want people thinking about those things. You just want them following the rules and doing what they're told. We have a different system here where every citizen is supposed to be able to participate in thinking about their own lives and the lives of others.
At the same time, though, and I'd like to get to both of your thoughts on this, we keep hearing, and Mark described the situation pretty well. We know that universities are underfunded. So, and we know that students are graduating with a lot of debt. So shouldn't universities be concerned that their students are able to find work in their field once they graduate?
Absolutely. I mean, no one thinks that they shouldn't be able to find work, but it shouldn't be incumbent on the university to prepare people for every exact job that's out there. That should be the job of the people who are hiring them for specific training for those positions. General training, absolutely, they should have the skills. But, let's talk about the management of the university for a second. I don't believe, and I don't think Mark believes, that there is a cabal of university administrators wringing their hands in some dark room like tobacco executives trying to figure out how to, make education the worst it could possibly be. What we have is people caught between a rock and a hard place with radically reduced government funding. They are forced to do things like, as you said, look to international students, to market the university as job training because that's what people are forced to want. If instead we were able to have the proper funding that universities should, have lower tuitions, have greater supports for students who are going to universities, we wouldn't be in this position that we're in, and university administrators would be freer to pursue the goals that are important for universities in a democratic society.
Now, gentlemen, I'm told you were nodding in agreement as Jesse was telling us about the Chief Electoral Officer's concerns about declining voter turnout. Mark, does that relate to today's topic, do you think?
Oh, absolutely. I think in several ways. One, learning the skills to be a critical and creative participant in a democracy doesn't just happen by accident. It starts in the K-12 system and then moves on to higher education. So I think that those skills are important to engage with at the university level. There's also, when you think about democracy and what holds a democracy in place, you can think of the free press. That's an important pillar. There's also the judiciary, an independent judiciary. There's the legislative body, our elections free and fair. And then the other pillar is the university itself as a way that speaks truth to power, as one that gives the best available evidence. When people often snidely characterize the university as an ivory tower, I always like to kind of correct that vision and say, well, we're more like a lighthouse. We're there to point out the rocks. And then it's up to the legislators to listen to us, to take into account the best available evidence that we have and turn that into effective public policy. And sadly, that's not always the case. But Garth, can I return to one thing about international students? I want to impress one piece, that they're not just cash cows, that they're not a problem. International students bring a wealth of cultural experience, of knowledge, of different ways of thinking, of sharing different ways of being in the world. And I think that any campus devoid of an international presence would be an impoverished one. And that every day in my classes when I'm teaching, I learn so much from the international students and the different perspectives and the different ways of interacting with their government, with their communities. And I think that we do a great disservice to all the students in our province if we didn't acknowledge how much we benefit from international students coming here, and not just in a financial sense.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it was necessarily a conversation about the benefit, more about whether they're being exploited, I think.
Definitely, I think that's an issue.
Yeah. Let's hear from Chris in Regina. Hi, Chris.
Good afternoon, Garth. Interesting topic. I have a foot in both, or in a couple of worlds here. So I was university educated, had a couple of degrees from a couple of different universities, but for the last 10 years, I've worked in post-secondary education in the college system. And perhaps, in future, what we need to see is better coordination between the universities, which perhaps could revert more to their, traditional role of liberal arts and humanities in providing that broad education that underpins our democratic traditions and history. On the other hand, the colleges are, seen more as the technical training grounds, the places that produce students that are trained for fairly specific roles. The courses typically are shorter and less expensive, and I see, an ideal education would almost consist of both of those pieces. Perhaps you go to university, do a couple of years of general studies, and then go off to a polytech, which is my employer, and do something that is more in line with the labor market requirements, because I do work in employment and career counseling, and I know that there is, right now in Canada, quite a disconnect between the labor market needs and what our post-secondary education, institutions are producing. There are a lot of skilled technologies, trades, et cetera, positions that are vacant because we're simply not producing enough graduates. So I think, we need to achieve a model where there's more integration in the two types of post-secondary. I also, and I agree with points that have been brought up by your guests, that the private enterprise and the corporate sector really has been getting a free ride for the longest time, because they're the ones who benefit from the public investment in post-secondary education. They need to be stepping up in terms of funding training, and if they're not willing to do it in the workplace on the job, then perhaps we need to look at some sort of a specific educational tax or levy to fund post-secondary education in Canada.
Yeah, Chris, you covered a lot of ground. Thanks for the call today.
Okay, thanks, Garth. Bye.
Mark, as I mentioned, Chris covered a lot of ground. Any thoughts?
Oh, I agree with Chris that a robust post-secondary education sector has to have both colleges and universities, and that they're both, important and should be valued as such. And I completely agree that I think both are required. They're a matter of choice, and they should be fluid. You might go to college and then decide you want to go to university, and vice versa. And I think that that's a plus, not a negative thing. And I think that gets lost sometimes. Increasingly, we have provincial governments trying to sort of confuse the matter, where they're trying to turn colleges into degree granting institutions, and then having universities focus on the job market, which would traditionally be a college in the college purview. So I think that we don't gain anything in society by having colleges and universities be lesser versions and more conflated versions of each other.
You know, Mark, earlier in the conversation, you talked about the importance of universities as the place where, basic fundamental research is done. But at the same time, we were talking about the fact that, I know at the U of S there are a number of corporate-sponsored chairs. Are universities losing that ability to do basic fundamental research because now, again, more and more of it being funded by industry is going to be dictated by industry?
I think that's absolutely an area of concern. I think if you look at the Tri-Council funding, the funding that does the natural sciences and engineering, so NSERC and SHRC, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, and then the CIHR, the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. If you look at those big Tri-Council funding bodies, their funding hasn't gone up, and it hasn't matched what we need in our modern, Canadian society. So that's a role for the federal government, I think, to play, where the federal government could increase funding to the Tri-Council agencies. But then on the provincial side, we have increasingly defunding of universities, and where they have to make up that shortfall somewhere. And then they turn to industry. But when they do so, industry is more about targeted research. They want to see results right away. But the truly groundbreaking innovations that happen on campuses all across Canada and across North America and the world really happen when people are dreaming up an idea that doesn't necessarily have a marketable place yet. And that will transform the way we even think about a whole field of study, a whole field of marketing even. On campuses all across Canada right now, there are graduates and about soon-to-be graduates who are thinking about a product or a way of thinking that doesn't even exist yet. So the jobs of tomorrow that no one's even thought about yet. And we need graduates to have the creative and critical skills to be flexible, for those to be portable, to match the sadly gig economy that faces our youth of today. The day of getting a job and staying there for 35 years, sadly those are numbered. There aren't too many jobs like that anymore. So you can expect, if you're a youth, to move around maybe 5 to 10 times in a career, different careers. And so you need your skills to be portable. And as Joel said earlier, if industry wants specific micro skills that they need to accomplish whatever it is, then they should bear the cost of training like they used to.
Okay. Going to go back to the phone lines now. Greg is in Regina. Hi, Greg.
Hi, how are you today?
I'm well, Greg. What are your thoughts?
I went to university in the late 60s, early 70s, and at that time, your annual tuition fee was approximately equal to 1 month's salary when you graduated. I don't know for sure what sort of comparison there is today, but the idea that university was low priced in the past, I think, is mistaken.
Okay, can you elaborate
1
on
month's
that a bit,
salary
Greg?
was quite a bit of money to give up at that time.
I wonder what that equation would be now. How many months?
That's kind of my question.
Yeah.
I presume that your panel has some insight into that.
Mm-hmm. Well, okay, let's put it to them. Mark or Joel, can either one of you sort of answer Greg's question? Because, on the face of it, 1 month's pay to pay for a year tuition seems like a deal, but what would be the equation now?
Well, it's certainly you wouldn't be paying tuition with 1 month's salary unless you're making close to $100,000 a year, which I don't think students would be making right away. So in the past, it is true that over a summer, that May to August those 4 months you could make enough to pay for your tuition and some of the living expenses, which just doesn't exist today. That opportunity doesn't exist. And that brings us back to that intergenerational theft of opportunity, that we're robbing our youth of that kind of opportunity that was available to them, that access, that they could work for a month and then afford their tuition, as Greg said on the call.
It is really valuable to society. It's a value to society to have people be educated, right? It's not just a value to the individual to have an education to be able to get a job. That's a very individualistic notion of university, and it has that role in part. But we also have a stake, and the country has a stake to have a society full of educated people, because otherwise we can't function properly. And so saddling people with debt as a punishment for going to university, whether in earlier times or today, is not a good way to build a democratic society or to sustain a society that we would all want to live in.
Okay, let's go to caller Ken in Flin Flon. Hi, Ken.
Hi, how you doing today?
I'm well, Ken. What are your thoughts on universities?
My thought is right on. My experience touches exactly on what you're discussing. I think the role of the university is not to be a trade school. It's to teach people to think and think critically, look beyond surface impressions, and draw your own conclusions. Think outside your frame of reference. Whereas the contrast I raise with that is my folks wanted me to go to military academies down in the States, and I applied for first year, didn't get it. I went to Florida State. They asked me to attend, and they thought my high school record mean that I'd be a good student. I love Florida State. I learned a lot. My intellectual horizon expanded widely. The next year, I did apply to the academies again, and I got the Naval Academy at Annapolis, Maryland. It sucked. They want you to obey blindly and automatically. Do not question anything. It's like your guest said, that is how you set up a dictatorial state. Well, that's what they wanted. Now, my parents told me, my grandmother attended the parents' weekend on Labor Day, but we couldn't attend as midshipmen. And they told the parents, but they didn't tell us, that the academy has more trouble with people who've had some university and then go to the academy versus those who had went to the academy directly out of high school. And the problem is just what you said. University, research university like Florida State teaches you how to think. Well, the military, they don't want that. That's fine for fighting a war, but not everybody needs to be in the military to fight a war. I hope it never comes to that. Mm-hmm. But then I went to work subsequently on a defense contract, ironically, and I had a wonderful boss. It was in the technical area, communications engineering. I had a master's degree in geography, and I says, Carl, that's my boss, I don't know anything about communications engineering. He says, that's fine. The fact you have a master's degree shows that you can learn. We can teach you what you need for this job. And that's what I hear in this discussion. I'd like to say that that's my experience, too. Why can't these companies show some commitment and take some of this on? Okay, I can learn. I don't know how to, Well, I learned drafting from that. I learned technical engineering, not engineering, but be the library. I learned to operate a computer and so forth like that. That was the hands-on. And you know how I got my hands-on experience? It was a drafting course I took in high school. But the academic course broadened my horizons greatly.
All right. Ken covered a lot of ground. Thanks so much for the call.
Yes, you're welcome. Thank you.
Joel, any thoughts on Ken's experience?
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better. Ken really pointed to the fact, one of the interesting things is that the business community itself constantly says they want broad thinkers who are able to think interdisciplinarily and bring together different facets of their education to bear on the job. So sure, there are some jobs where you need very specific training, and Ken said it well. Well, then the corporations should provide that training. But for many jobs, especially when we talk about jobs in the 21st century, right, in information economy, what we want is people who can think critically, who can think broadly, and who can think in the ways that universities in their traditional sense used to inculcate people into doing. Many of the callers might recall their university experiences where a lot of their education took place in the in-betweens of university life, not even in each lecture for a course, but in the breaks, in evening conversations about those courses. Those are the kinds of things that are getting lost in our current configuration of university life.
Okay, I want to sort of open a can of worms. Joel, earlier in the conversation, you were talking about the importance of universities to democracy. And there always seems to be controversy on Canadian campuses. It seems to be the front line of the culture war. Is free expression still part of that university experience? If the Jordan Petersons and the Ann Coulters or supporters of Israel are simply shut down by the loudest group on campus, is there still a place for an intellectual debate? Is there a place for people with controversial opinions to be debated in academic spaces, or not? Is it now just the rule of the loudest interest group on campus? Joel?
Well, I said before that multiple perspectives, learning to deal with multiple perspectives is extremely important. But let me say that in a more pointed way. Politics, the word politics has become sort of a dirty word in our culture, right? If I say, Garth, you're just being political, it's like I've insulted you, like you're a mudslinging candidate running for political office and you don't care about anything but your own power. But politics, the word, has a much more noble history. The author Bernard Crick said that politics is the way people in a democratic society come together to work out their differences and move forwards towards social policy. It's about compromise. It's about debate. It's about talking across differences. That has to be a major role of universities. Now, within that, there are issues of academic freedom and the fact that not every possible thing that one can say should be said, especially when we think of protecting the various students on campus, not from ideas, but from hate. And so that's a trickier thing. And I know Marc can speak to that as well, specifically the aspect of academic freedom.
Well, I'd like to hear your thoughts, Marc, on because I've got to tell you, from my perspective, just as an observer, I'm concerned that a pro-Israeli speaker at a university campus may as well not even show up. And I'm not defending their political views, but the Jordan Petersons or Ann Coulters, it seems to me, should at least be heard out, not yelled down. What are your thoughts?
Well, let's be clear about one thing. On campuses all across Canada today, there are these debates being held without any incident at all, that people are exchanging those ideas and they're confronting people who disagree and have a very different worldview. So that's happening, and you don't hear about it because it's working as it ought to, that people are having a civil debate, and it's working, and people can walk away. Maybe they don't agree, but they have a better understanding of where that person was coming from. Now, of course, it does happen. There's a flashpoint, and students or other people might prevent someone from speaking on a campus, and that makes the headlines, of course. It's fun to read. It's salacious, what's happening on campus. Oh, they've stopped someone from speaking. But where I draw the line, and I do a fair bit of reading on academic freedom, is that people should and ought to have debates with others who you completely disagree with, but you hear them out and then you give your reasons why that may be a misguided way of thinking about whatever the issue is. Now, the one thing you do not get or do not have a right to do is to debate whether someone has the right to exist at all. And so on campuses, the university has a responsibility to the students, to the people who work there. A campus is a wide place. It's not just the classroom. It's research labs. It's residences. It's food courts. It's a little metropolis on its own. And so there, the institution has a responsibility to protect the people who operate within it. And so you never, not on a campus and where people have the responsibility, and not in society at large, really have the right to debate whether some people, some humans have a right to exist or not. And so I would draw the line there. And
okay, one of the examples I use, and I'd like to get your thoughts on it then, is the Israel-Palestinian conflict. It seems that it's perfectly acceptable to question Israel's right to exist.
No, I don't think so. I think you'll see that both that area is a flashpoint, of course, but people can and should make a difference between critiquing the Israeli government and its policies and the Jewish religion, let's say, and that's a different piece, and that those things get conflated, and purposefully so, I must add. by people who want that debate to happen. So it's cloaked in anti-Semitism when really you're critiquing the policies of a government. So those things do, I agree, become heated and can be a powder keg. But I would say, by and large, those conversations do happen in a very civil way, even though people may feel uncomfortable. Now, where people, again, I'll get back to, you don't have a right to decide that anybody has a right to exist or not. So whether it's whatever attribute that they may hold, you don't get to get up on stage and talk about whether they exist or not. That's a dangerous, harmful position to put students in or people who are at the university. And the other point I'll just add is that the university is also a collection of stages and classrooms that get rented out that aren't really part of the university. It could be an outside group that brings someone there because the university still has a lot of cachet. It still has a lot of respect and authority. So people will often book a room purposefully on a university campus, but it's not actually part of the university.
Okay. We're going to take one more caller here before we run out of time today. Rhonda in Regina, I got to ask you to keep it tight today. Rhonda, go ahead.
Sure. I would like some comments on students, given the fact that they leave university with such debt. The idea of, taking 2 semesters, say, and then taking a year off, and so to earn money and then coming back, and the pros and cons of that, and how the universities can facilitate that kind of choice and the delay of degree and getting into the workforce.
Okay.
Can I say something on that?
Yeah, please, Joel, go ahead.
Yeah, that is an immediate reality, and of course we have to try and address the reality that students now graduate with a lot of debt. But I think it's more important, or equally important, to figure out ways that students don't graduate with that kind of debt. It again goes back to this idea of what kind of society do we want to live in. We want people to have the opportunity to have a proper 4-year education before they're getting the job training skills, the specific job training skills. And so we really need to focus on education is one of the best investments a society can make, again, even on the playing field of economics. There's lots of evidence that the cost of healthcare goes down with a more educated public. Violence decreases. All kinds of things that we spend money on later could be cut off at the beginning by greater investment in education.
Right. But my question is, given the reality of how things are now, and so looking at decisions in terms of, do I take longer to go through university and then get my degree and be educated as you just described, but at the same time not leave university with this huge debt? So then this balance of perhaps studying some and working some. I do completely agree with your point. Yeah, but
there are a lot of universities that allow that, right? There's a lot of flexibility in that regard in a lot of universities.
And actually, that reflects the reality of students today. They are working. Most of my students are working. Yeah. They're working several jobs often to help service the debt that they're incurring by going. The other piece that I should say that COVID has taught us is that the university can be very nimble and move on a dime to rejig all of their offerings in order to allow it to be streamed into homes, allow it to get to communities that have accessibility issues. There's not a university campus in every community. So in that regard, people often see universities as slow-moving institutions. But they were able to move on a dime and shift all of their delivery of their programs within days. We had days' notice to switch everything over. And I think given those circumstances, we did a pretty good job.
Okay, gentlemen, we've only got 3 minutes left, so I'll ask each of you in turn. I'll start with you, Joel. How do universities have to change to not only survive but thrive and be relevant?
I think that we really have to decrease the emphasis on universities as exclusively job training. Again, as I said, this is an important aspect of universities. We all want students to graduate with the dispositions and the skills they need to get meaningful employment, but that's simply not enough for universities in a democratic society, and for K-12 education for that matter. What we need is education systems that take seriously their responsibility in educating citizens to participate in democratic life.
And Marc, I'll give you the last word.
Well, universities have to speak out. We can't go quietly into that good night. We have to bring forward and bring to light all that is lost if we lose the university as an institution that is there to do research, teaching, and service.
And finally, do you think that's possible?
Absolutely. That's what we're going to be talking about today, tonight, and all weekend, and going into the weekend. And I think that those conversations will continue. And absolutely, I'm a radical optimist.
A radical optimist. I like that. Thanks so much. Marc, Joel, thank you so much for taking time to come into studio and be with us today. It's been an eye-opener. Thank you.
Thanks, Garth. It's a pleasure to be here.